Chapter 21. The Flight to the Jungle. Sleepless upon his blankets, Albert Werper let his evil mind dwell upon the charms of the woman in the nearby tent. He had noted Mohammed Beyd's sudden interest in the girl, and judging the man by his own standards, had guessed at the basis of the Arab's sudden change of attitude toward the prisoner. And as he let his imaginings run riot, they aroused within him a bestial jealousy of Mohammed Beyd, and a great fear that the other might encompass his base designs upon the defenseless girl. By a strange process of reasoning, Werper, whose designs were identical with the Arab's, pictured himself as Jane Clayton's protector, and presently convinced himself that the attentions which might seem hideous to her if proffered by Mohammed Beyd would be welcomed from Albert Werper. Her husband was dead, and Werper fancied that he could replace in the girl's heart the position which had been vacated by the act of the Grim Reaper. He could offer Jane Clayton marriage, a thing which Mohammed Beyd would not offer, and which the girl would spurn from him with as deep disgust as she would his unholy lust. It was not long before the Belgian had succeeded in convincing himself that the captive not only had every reason for having conceived sentiments of love for him, but that she had by various feminine methods acknowledged her newborn affection. And then a sudden resolution possessed him. He threw the blankets from him and rose to his feet. Pulling on his boots and buckling his cartridge belt and revolver about his hips, he stepped to the flap of his tent and looked out. There was no sentry before the entrance to the prisoner's tent. What could it mean? Fate was indeed playing into his hands. Stepping outside, he passed to the rear of the girl's tent. There was no sentry there either, and now, boldly, he walked to the entrance and stepped within. Dimly the moonlight illumined the interior. Across the tent, a figure bent above the blankets of a bed. There was a whispered word, and another figure rose from the blankets to a sitting position. Slowly, Albert Werper's eyes were becoming accustomed to the half-darkness of the tent. He saw that the figure leaning over the bed was that of a man, and he guessed at the truth of the nocturnal visitor's identity. A sullen, jealous rage enveloped him. He took a step in the direction of the two. He heard a frightened cry break from the girl's lips as she recognized the features of the man above her, and he saw Mohammed Beyd seize her by the throat and bear her back upon the blankets. Cheated passion cast a red blur before the eyes of the Belgian. No, the man should not have her. She was for him and him alone. He would not be robbed of his rights. Quickly he ran across the tent and threw himself upon the back of Mohammed Beyd. The latter, though surprised by this sudden and unexpected attack, was not one to give up without a battle. The Belgian's fingers were feeling for his throat, but the Arab tore them away and, rising, wheeled upon his adversary. As they faced each other, Werper struck the Arab a heavy blow in the face, sending him staggering backward. If he had followed up his advantage, he would have had Mohammed Beyd at his mercy in another moment, but instead he tugged at his revolver to draw it from its holster, and fate ordained that at that particular moment the weapon should stick in its leather scabbard. Before he could disengage it, Mohammed Beyd had recovered himself and was dashing upon him. Again Werper struck the other in the face, and the Arab returned the blow. Striking at each other and ceaselessly attempting to clinch, the two battled about the small interior of the tent, while the girl, wide-eyed in terror and astonishment, watched the duel in frozen silence. Again and again Werper struggled to draw his weapon. Mohammed Beyd, anticipating no such opposition to his base desires, had come to the tent unarmed, except for a long knife which he now drew as he stood panting during the first brief rest of the encounter. "Dog of a Christian," he whispered, "look upon this knife in the hands of Mohammed Beyd. Look well, unbeliever, for it is the last thing in life that you shall see or feel. With it Mohammed Beyd will cut out your black heart. If you have a God, pray to him now. In a minute more you shall be dead." And with that he rushed viciously upon the Belgian, his knife raised high above his head. Werper was still dragging futilely at his weapon. The Arab was almost upon him. In desperation the European waited until Mohammed Beyd was all but against him. Then he threw himself to one side to the floor of the tent, leaving a leg extended in the path of the Arab. The trick succeeded. Mohammed Beyd, carried on by the momentum of his charge, stumbled over the projecting obstacle and crashed to the ground. Instantly he was up again and wheeling to renew the battle, but Werper was on foot ahead of him, and now his revolver, loosened from its holster, flashed in his hand. The Arab dove headfirst to grapple with him. There was a sharp report, a lurid gleam of flame in the darkness, and Mohammed Beyd rolled over and over upon the floor to come to a final rest beside the bed of the woman he had sought to dishonor. Almost immediately following the report came the sound of excited voices in the camp without. Men were calling back and forth to one another asking the meaning of the shot. Werper could hear them running hither and thither investigating. Jane Clayton had risen to her feet as the Arab died, and now she came forward with outstretched hands toward Werper. "How can I ever thank you, my friend?" she asked. "And to think that only today I had almost believed the infamous story which this beast told me of your perfidy and of your past. Forgive me, Mr. Fricolt. I might have known that a white man and a gentleman could be naught else than the protector of a woman of his own race amid the dangers of this savage land." Werper's hands dropped limply at his sides. He stood looking at the girl, but he could find no words to reply to her. Her innocent arraignment of his true purposes was unanswerable. Outside, the Arabs were searching for the author of the disturbing shot. The 2 sentries who had been relieved and sent to their blankets by Mohammed Bede were the first to suggest going to the tent of the prisoner. It occurred to them that possibly the woman had successfully defended herself against their leader. Werper heard the men approaching. To be apprehended as the slayer of Mohammed Bede would be equivalent to a sentence of immediate death. The fierce and brutal raiders would tear to pieces a Christian who had dared spill the blood of their leader. He must find some excuse to delay the finding of Mohammed Bede's dead body. Returning his revolver to its holster, he walked quickly to the entrance of the tent. Parting the flaps, he stepped out and confronted the men, who were rapidly approaching. Somehow he found within him the necessary bravado to force a smile to his lips as he held up his hand to bar their farther progress. "The woman resisted," he said, "and Mohammed Bede was forced to shoot her. She is not dead, only slightly wounded. You may go back to your blankets. Mohammed Bede and I will look after the prisoner." Then he turned and re-entered the tent, and the raiders, satisfied by this explanation, gladly returned to their broken slumbers. As he again faced Jane Clayton, Werper found himself animated by quite different intentions than those which had lured him from his blankets but a few minutes before. The excitement of his encounter with Mohammed Bede, as well as the dangers which he now faced at the hands of the raiders when morning must inevitably reveal the truth of what had occurred in the tent of the prisoner that night, had naturally cooled the hot passion which had dominated him when he entered the tent. But another and stronger force was exerting itself in the girl's favor. However low a man may sink, honor and chivalry, as he ever possessed them, are never entirely eradicated from his character, and though Albert Werper had long since ceased to evidence the slightest claim to either the one or the other, the spontaneous acknowledgement of them which the girl's speech had presumed had reawakened them both within him. For the first time he realized the almost hopeless and frightful position of the fair captive, and the depths of ignominy to which he had sunk, that had made it possible for him, a well-born European gentleman, to have entertained even for a moment the part that he had taken in the ruin of her home, happiness, and herself. Too much of baseness already lay at the threshold of his conscience for him ever to hope entirely to redeem himself, but in the first sudden burst of contrition the man conceived an honest intention to undo, in so far as lay within his power, the evil that his criminal avarice had brought upon this sweet and unoffending woman. As he stood apparently listening to the retreating footsteps, Jane Clayton approached him. "What are we to do now?" she asked. "Morning will bring discovery of this," and she pointed to the still body of Mohammed Bede. "They will kill you when they find him." For a time Werper did not reply. Then he turned suddenly toward the woman. "I have a plan," he cried. "It will require nerve and courage on your part, but you have already shown that you possess both. Can you endure still more?" "I can endure anything," she replied with a brave smile, "that may offer us even a slight chance for escape." "You must simulate death," he explained. "While I carry you from the camp, I will explain to the sentries that Mohammed Bede has ordered me to take your body into the jungle. This seemingly unnecessary act one shall explain upon the grounds that Mohammed Bede had conceived a violent passion for you, and that he so regretted the act by which he had become your slayer that he could not endure the silent reproach of your lifeless body." The girl held up her hand to stop. A smile touched her lips. "Are you quite mad?" she asked. "Do you imagine that the sentries will credit any such ridiculous tale?" "You do not know them," he replied. "Beneath their rough exteriors, despite their calloused and criminal natures, there exists in each a well-defined strain of romantic emotionalism. You will find it among such as these throughout the world. It is romance which lures men to lead wild lives of outlawry and crime. The ruse will succeed, never fear. Jane Clayton shrugged. We can but try it, and then what? I shall hide you in the jungle, continued the Belgian, coming for you alone and with 2 horses in the morning. But how will you explain Mohammed Bade's death, she asked. It will be discovered before ever you can escape the camp in the morning. I shall not explain it, replied Werper. Mohammed Bade shall explain it himself. We must leave that to him. Are you ready for the venture? Yes. But wait, I must get your weapon and ammunition, and Werper walked quickly from the tent. Very shortly he returned with an extra revolver and ammunition belt strapped about his waist. Are you ready? He asked. Quite ready, replied the girl. Then come and throw yourself limply across my left shoulder, and Werper knelt to receive her. There, he said as he rose to his feet. Now, let your arms, your legs, and your head hang limply. Remember that you are dead. A moment later the man walked out into the camp, the body of the woman across his shoulder. A thorn boma had been thrown up about the camp to discourage the bolder of the hungry carnivora. A couple of sentries paced to and fro in the light of a fire which they kept burning brightly. The nearer of these looked up in surprise as he saw Werper approaching. Who are you? He cried. What have you there? Werper raised the hood of his burnous that the fellow might see his face. This is the body of the woman, he explained. Mohammed Bade has asked me to take it into the jungle, for he cannot bear to look upon the face of her whom he loved, and whom necessity compelled him to slay. He suffers greatly, he is inconsolable. It was with difficulty that I prevented him taking his own life. Across the speaker's shoulder, limp and frightened, the girl waited for the Arab's reply. He would laugh at this preposterous story, of that she was sure. In an instant he would unmask the deception that M. Fricoult was attempting to practice upon him, and they would both be lost. She tried to plan how best she might aid her would-be rescuer in the fight which must most certainly follow within a moment or two. Then she heard the voice of the Arab as he replied to M. Fricoult. Are you going alone, or do you wish me to awaken someone to accompany you? He asked, and his tone denoted not the least surprise that Mohammed Bade had suddenly discovered such remarkably sensitive characteristics. I shall go alone, replied Werper, and he passed on and out through the narrow opening in the boma by which the sentry stood. A moment later he had entered among the boles of the trees with his burden, and when safely hidden from the sentry's view, lowered the girl to her feet with a low sheesh when she would have spoken. Then he led her a little farther into the forest, halted beneath a large tree with spreading branches, buckled a cartridge belt and revolver about her waist, and assisted her to clamber into the lower branches. Tomorrow, he whispered, as soon as I can elude them, I will return for you. Be brave, Lady Greystoke, we may yet escape. Thank you, she replied in a low tone. You have been very kind and very brave. Werper did not reply, and the darkness of the night hid the scarlet flush of shame which swept upward across his face. Quickly he turned and made his way back to camp. The sentry from his post saw him enter his own tent, but he did not see him crawl under the canvas at the rear and sneak cautiously to the tent which the prisoner had occupied, where now lay the dead body of Mohammed Bade. Raising the lower edge of the rear wall, Werper crept within and approached the corpse. Without an instant's hesitation he seized the dead wrists and dragged the body upon its back to the point where he had just entered. On hands and knees he backed out as he had come in, drawing the corpse after him. Once outside, the Belgian crept to the side of the tent and surveyed as much of the camp as lay within his vision. No one was watching. Returning to the body, he lifted it to his shoulder and, risking all on a quick sally, ran swiftly across the narrow opening which separated the prisoner's tent from that of the dead man. Behind the silken wall he halted and lowered his burden to the ground, and there he remained motionless for several minutes, listening. Satisfied at last that no one had seen him, he stooped and raised the bottom of the tent wall, backed in and dragged the thing that had been Mohammed Bade after him. To the sleeping rugs of the dead raider he drew the corpse. Then he fumbled about in the darkness until he had found Mohammed Bade's revolver. With the weapon in his hand, he returned to the side of the dead man, kneeled beside the bedding, and inserted his right hand with the weapon beneath the rugs, piled a number of thicknesses of the closely woven fabric over and about the revolver with his left hand. Then he pulled the trigger, and at the same time he coughed. The muffled report could not have been heard above the sound of his cough by one directly outside the tent. Werper was satisfied. A grim smile touched his lips as he withdrew the weapon from the rugs and placed it carefully in the right hand of the dead man, fixing 3 of the fingers around the grip and the index finger inside the trigger guard. A moment longer he tarried to rearrange the disordered rugs, and then he left as he had entered, fastening down the rear wall of the tent as it had been before he had raised it. Going to the tent of the prisoner, he removed there also the evidence that someone might have come or gone beneath the rear wall. Then he returned to his own tent, entered, fastened down the canvas, and crawled into his blankets. The following morning he was awakened by the excited voice of Muhammad Beyd's slave calling to him at the entrance of his tent. "Quick, quick," cried the black in a frightened tone. "Come, Muhammad Beyd is dead in his tent, dead by his own hand." Werper sat up quickly in his blankets at the first alarm, a startled expression upon his countenance, but at the last words of the black a sigh of relief escaped his lips, and a slight smile replaced the tense lines upon his face. "I come," he called to the slave, and drawing on his boots rose and went out of his tent. Excited Arabs and blacks were running from all parts of the camp toward the silken tent of Muhammad Beyd, and when Werper entered he found a number of the raiders crowded about the corpse, now cold and stiff. Shouldering his way among them, the Belgian halted beside the dead body of the raider. He looked down in silence for a moment upon the still face, then he wheeled upon the Arabs. "Who has done this thing?" he cried. His tone was both menacing and accusing. "Who has murdered Muhammad Beyd?" A sudden chorus of voices arose in tumultuous protest. "Muhammad Beyd was not murdered," they cried. "He died by his own hand. This and Allah are our witnesses," and they pointed to a revolver in the dead man's hand. For a time Werper pretended to be skeptical, but at last permitted himself to be convinced that Muhammad Beyd had indeed killed himself in remorse for the death of the white woman he had, all unknown to his followers, loved so devotedly. Werper himself wrapped the blankets of the dead man about the corpse, taking care to fold inward the scorched and bullet-torn fabric that had muffled the report of the weapon he had fired the night before. Then 6 husky blacks carried the body out into the clearing where the camp stood and deposited it in a shallow grave. As the loose earth fell upon the silent form beneath the telltale blankets, Albert Werper heaved another sigh of relief. His plan had worked out even better than he had dared hope. With Achmet Zeke and Muhammad Beyd both dead, the raiders were without a leader, and after a brief conference they decided to return into the north on visits to the various tribes to which they belonged. Werper, after learning the direction they intended taking, announced that for his part he was going east to the coast, and as they knew of nothing he possessed which any of them coveted, they signified their willingness that he should go his way. As they rode off, he sat his horse in the center of the clearing, watching them disappear one by one into the jungle, and thanked his God that he had at last escaped their villainous clutches. When he could no longer hear any sound of them, he turned to the right and rode into the forest toward the tree where he had hidden Lady Greystoke, and drawing rein beneath it, called up in a gay and hopeful voice a pleasant "Good morning." There was no reply, and though his eyes searched the thick foliage above him, he could see no sign of the girl. Dismounting, he quickly climbed into the tree, where he could obtain a view of all its branches. The tree was empty. Jane Clayton had vanished during the silent watches of the jungle night. Chapter 22. Tarzan recovers his reason. As Tarzan let the pebbles from the recovered pouch run through his fingers, his thoughts returned to the pile of yellow ingots about which the Arabs and the Abyssinians had waged their relentless battle. What was there in common between that pile of dirty metal and the beautiful sparkling pebbles that had formerly been in his pouch? What was the metal? From whence had it come? What was that tantalizing half-conviction which seemed to demand the recognition of his memory that the yellow pile for which these men had fought and died had been intimately connected with his past, that it had been his? What had been his past? He shook his head. Vaguely the memory of his apish childhood passed slowly in review, then came a strangely tangled mass of faces, figures and events which seemed to have no relation to Tarzan of the Apes, and yet which were, even in their fragmentary form, familiar. Slowly and painfully, recollection was attempting to reassert itself. The hurt brain was mending, as the cause of its recent failure to function was being slowly absorbed or removed by the healing processes of perfect circulation. The people who now passed before his mind's eye for the first time in weeks wore familiar faces, but yet he could neither place them in the niches they had once filled in his past life, nor call them by name. One was a fair she, and it was her face which most often moved through the tangled recollections of his convalescing brain. Who was she? What had she been to Tarzan of the Apes? He seemed to see her about the very spot upon which the pile of gold had been unearthed by the Abyssinians, but the surroundings were vastly different from those which now obtained. There was a building, there were many buildings, and there were hedges, fences, and flowers. Tarzan puckered his brow in puzzled study of the wonderful problem. For an instant he seemed to grasp the whole of a true explanation, and then, just as success was within his grasp, the picture faded into a jungle scene where a naked white youth danced in company with a band of hairy, primordial ape things. Tarzan shook his head and sighed. Why was it that he could not recollect? At least he was sure that in some way the pile of gold, the place where it lay, the subtle aroma of the elusive she he had been pursuing, the memory figure of the white woman, and he himself were inextricably connected by the ties of a forgotten past. If the woman belonged there, what better place to search or await her than the very spot which his broken recollections seemed to assign to her? It was worth trying. Tarzan slipped the thong of the empty pouch over his shoulder and started off through the trees in the direction of the plain. At the outskirts of the forest he met the Arabs returning in search of Akmzik. Hiding, he let them pass, and then resumed his way toward the charred ruins of the home he had been almost upon the point of recalling to his memory. His journey across the plain was interrupted by the discovery of a small herd of antelope in a little swale, where the cover and the wind were well combined to make stalking easy. A fat yearling rewarded a half-hour of stealthy creeping and a sudden savage rush, and it was late in the afternoon when the ape-man settled himself upon his haunches beside his kill to enjoy the fruits of his skill, his cunning, and his prowess. His hunger-satisfied thirst next claimed his attention. The river lured him by the shortest path toward its refreshing waters, and when he had drunk, night already had fallen and he was some half-mile or more downstream from the point where he had seen the pile of yellow ingots, and where he hoped to meet the memory woman, or find some clue to her whereabouts or her identity. To the jungle-bred, time is usually a matter of small moment, and haste, except when engendered by terror, by rage, or by hunger, is distasteful. Today was gone. Therefore tomorrow, of which there was an infinite procession, would answer admirably for Tarzan's further quest. And, besides, the ape-man was tired and would sleep. A tree afforded him the safety, seclusion, and comforts of a well-appointed bedchamber, and to the chorus of the hunters and the hunted of the wild river bank he soon dropped off into deep slumber. Morning found him both hungry and thirsty again, and dropping from his tree he made his way to the drinking place at the river's edge. There he found Numa the lion ahead of him. The big fellow was lapping the water greedily, and at the approach of Tarzan along the trail in his rear, he raised his head, and turning his gaze backward across his man's shoulders, glared at the intruder. A low growl of warning rumbled from his throat, but Tarzan, guessing that the beast had but just quitted his kill and was well filled, merely made a slight detour and continued to the river, where he stopped a few yards above the tawny cat, and dropping upon his hands and knees plunged his face into the cool water. For a moment the lion continued to eye the man, then he resumed his drinking, and man and beast quenched their thirst side by side, each apparently oblivious of the other's presence. Numa was the first to finish. Raising his head, he gazed across the river for a few minutes with that stony fixity of attention which is a characteristic of his kind. But for the ruffling of his black mane to the touch of the passing breeze, he might have been wrought from golden bronze, so motionless, so statuesque his pose. A deep sigh from the cavernous lungs dispelled the illusion. The mighty head swung slowly around until the yellow eyes rested upon the man. The bristled lip curved upward, exposing yellow fangs. Another warning growl vibrated the heavy jowls, and the king of beasts turned majestically about and paced slowly up the trail into the dense reeds. Tarzan of the Apes drank on, but from the corners of his grey eyes he watched the great brute's every move until he had disappeared from view, and after his keen ears marked the movements of the carnivore. A plunge in the river was followed by a scant breakfast of eggs which chance discovered to him, and then he set off upriver toward the ruins of the bungalow where the golden ingots had marked the center of yesterday's battle. And when he came upon the spot, great was his surprise and consternation, for the yellow metal had disappeared. The earth, trampled by the feet of horses and men, gave no clue. It was as though the ingots had evaporated into thin air. The ape-man was at a loss to know where to turn or what next to do. There was no sign of any spoor which might denote that she had been here. The metal was gone, and if there was any connection between the she and the metal, it seemed useless to wait for her now that the latter had been removed elsewhere. Everything seemed to elude him: the pretty pebbles, the yellow metal, the she, his memory. Tarzan was disgusted. He would go back into the jungle and look for Cholk, and so he turned his steps once more toward the forest. He moved rapidly, swinging across the plain in a long, easy trot, and at the edge of the forest, taking to the trees with the agility and speed of a small monkey. His direction was aimless. He merely raced on and on through the jungle, the joy of unfettered action his principal urge, with the hope of stumbling upon some clue to Cholk or the she, a secondary incentive. For 2 days he roamed about, killing, eating, drinking, and sleeping, wherever inclination and the means to indulge it occurred simultaneously. It was upon the morning of the 3rd day that the scent spoor of horse and man were wafted faintly to his nostrils. Instantly he altered his course to glide silently through the branches in the direction from which the scent came. It was not long before he came upon a solitary horseman riding toward the east. Instantly his eyes confirmed what his nose had previously suspected: the rider was he who had stolen his pretty pebbles. The light of rage flared suddenly in the grey eyes as the ape-man dropped lower among the branches until he moved almost directly above the unconscious Werper. There was a quick leap, and the Belgian felt a heavy body hurtle onto the rump of his terror-stricken mount. The horse, snorting, leapt forward. Giant arms encircled the rider, and in the twinkling of an eye he was dragged from his saddle to find himself lying in the narrow trail with a naked, white giant kneeling upon his breast. Recognition came to Werper with the first glance at his captor's face, and a pallor of fear overspread his features. Strong fingers were at his throat, fingers of steel. He tried to cry out, to plead for his life, but the cruel fingers denied him speech, as they were as surely denying him life. "The pretty pebbles," cried the man upon his breast. "What did you with the pretty pebbles, with Tarzan's pretty pebbles?" The fingers relaxed to permit a reply. For some time Werper could only choke and cough. At last he regained the powers of speech. "Achmet Zik, the Arab, stole them from me," he cried. "He made me give up the pouch and the pebbles." "I saw all that," replied Tarzan, "but the pebbles in the pouch were not the pebbles of Tarzan. They were only such pebbles as fill the bottoms of the rivers and the shelving banks beside them. Even the Arab would not have them, for he threw them away in anger when he had looked upon them. It is my pretty pebbles that I want. Where are they?" I do not know, cried Werper. "I gave them to Achmet Zik, or he would have killed me. A few minutes later he followed me along the trail to slay me, although he had promised to molest me no further, and I shot and killed him. But the pouch was not upon his person, and though I searched about the jungle for some time I could not find it." "I found it, I tell you," growled Tarzan, "and I also found the pebbles which Achmet Zik had thrown away in disgust. They were not Tarzan's pebbles. You have hidden them. Tell me where they are, or I will kill you." And the brown fingers of the ape-man closed a little tighter upon the throat of his victim. Werper struggled to free himself. "My God, Lord Greystoke," he managed to scream, "would you commit murder for a handful of stones?" The fingers at his throat relaxed. A puzzled, far-away expression softened the grey eyes. "Lord Greystoke," repeated the ape-man. "Lord Greystoke. Who is Lord Greystoke? Where have I heard that name before?" "Why, man, you are Lord Greystoke," cried the Belgian. "You were injured by a falling rock when the earthquake shattered the passage to the underground chamber to which you and your black waziri had come to fetch golden ingots back to your bungalow. The blow shattered your memory. You are John Clayton, Lord Greystoke, don't you remember?" "John Clayton, Lord Greystoke," repeated Tarzan. Then for a moment he was silent. Presently his hand went falteringly to his forehead. An expression of wonderment filled his eyes, of wonderment and sudden understanding. The forgotten name had reawakened the returning memory that had been struggling to reassert itself. The ape-man relinquished his grasp upon the throat of the Belgian and leaped to his feet. "God," he cried, and then Jane. Suddenly he turned toward Werper. "My wife," he asked. "What has become of her?" "The farm is in ruins. You know, you have had something to do with all this. You followed me to Opar. You stole the jewels which I thought but pretty pebbles. You are a crook. Do not try to tell me that you are not." "He is worse than a crook," said a quiet voice close behind them. Tarzan turned in astonishment to see a tall man in uniform standing in the trail a few paces from him. Back of the man were a number of black soldiers in the uniform of the Congo Free State. "He is a murderer, monsieur," continued the officer. I have followed him for a long time to take him back to stand trial for the killing of his superior officer. Werper was upon his feet now, gazing, white and trembling, at the fate which had overtaken him even in the fastness of the labyrinthine jungle. Instinctively he turned to flee, but Tarzan of the Apes reached out a strong hand and grasped him by the shoulder. "Wait," said the ape-man to his captive. "This gentleman wishes you, and so do I. When I am through with you, he may have you. Tell me what has become of my wife." The Belgian officer eyed the almost naked white giant with curiosity. He noted the strange contrast of primitive weapons and apparel, and the easy, fluent French which the man spoke. The former denoted the lowest, the latter the highest type of culture. He could not quite determine the social status of this strange creature, but he knew that he did not relish the easy assurance with which the fellow presumed to dictate when he might take possession of the prisoner. "Pardon me," he said, stepping forward and placing his hand on Werper's other shoulder, "but this gentleman is my prisoner. He must come with me." "When I am through with him," replied Tarzan, quietly. The officer turned and beckoned to the soldiers standing in the trail behind him. A company of uniformed blacks stepped quickly forward and, pushing past the three, surrounded the ape-man and his captive. "Both the law and the power to enforce it are upon my side," announced the officer. "Let us have no trouble. If you have a grievance against this man, you may return with me and enter your charge regularly before an authorized tribunal." "Your legal rights are not above suspicion, my friend," replied Tarzan. "And your power to enforce your commands are only apparent, not real. You have presumed to enter British territory with an armed force. Where is your authority for this invasion? Where are the extradition papers which warrant the arrest of this man? And what assurance have you that I cannot bring an armed force about you that will prevent your return to the Congo Free State?" The Belgian lost his temper. "I have no disposition to argue with a naked savage," he cried. "Unless you wish to be hurt, you will not interfere with me. Take the prisoner, Sergeant." Werper raised his lips close to Tarzan's ear. "Keep me from them, and I can show you the very spot where I saw your wife last night," he whispered. "She cannot be far from here at this very minute." The soldiers, following the signal from their sergeant, closed in to seize Werper. Tarzan grabbed the Belgian about the waist, and bearing him beneath his arm as he might have borne a sack of flour, leaped forward in an attempt to break through the cordon. His right fist caught the nearest soldier upon the jaw and sent him hurtling backward upon his fellows. Clubbed rifles were torn from the hands of those who barred his way, and right and left the black soldiers stumbled aside in the face of the ape-man's savage break for liberty. So completely did the blacks surround the two that they dared not fire for fear of hitting one of their own number. And Tarzan was already through them, and upon the point of dodging into the concealing mazes of the jungle when one who had sneaked upon him from behind struck him a heavy blow upon the head with a rifle. In an instant the ape-man was down and a dozen black soldiers were upon his back. When he regained consciousness, he found himself securely bound, as was Werper also. The Belgian officer, success having crowned his efforts, was in good humor and inclined to chaff his prisoners about the ease with which they had been captured, but from Tarzan of the Apes he elicited no response. Werper, however, was voluble in his protests. He explained that Tarzan was an English lord, but the officer only laughed at the assertion and advised his prisoner to save his breath for his defense in court. As soon as Tarzan regained his senses and it was found that he was not seriously injured, the prisoners were hastened into line and the return march toward the Congo Free State boundary commenced. Toward evening the column halted beside a stream, made camp and prepared the evening meal. From the thick foliage of the nearby jungle a pair of fierce eyes watched the activities of the uniformed blacks with silent intensity and curiosity. From beneath beetling brows the creatures saw the boma constructed, the fires built, and the supper prepared. Tarzan and Werper had been lying bound behind a small pile of knapsacks from the time that the company had halted, but with the preparation of the meal completed, their guard ordered them to rise and come forward to one of the fires where their hands would be unfettered that they might eat. As the giant ape-man rose, a startled expression of recognition entered the eyes of the watcher in the jungle, and a low guttural broke from the savage lips. Instantly Tarzan was alert, but the answering growl died upon his lips, suppressed by the fear that it might arouse the suspicions of the soldiers. Suddenly an inspiration came to him. He turned toward Werper. "I am going to speak to you in a loud voice and in a tongue which you do not understand. Appear to listen intently to what I say, and occasionally mumble something as though replying in the same language. Our escape may hinge upon the success of your efforts." Werper nodded in assent and understanding, and immediately there broke from the lips of his companion a strange jargon which might have been compared with equal propriety to the barking and growling of a dog and the chattering of monkeys. The nearer soldiers looked in surprise at the ape-man. Some of them laughed, while others drew away in evident superstitious fear. The officer approached the prisoners while Tarzan was still jabbering, and halted behind them, listening in perplexed interest. When Werper mumbled some ridiculous jargon in reply, his curiosity broke bounds, and he stepped forward, demanding to know what language it was that they spoke. Tarzan had gauged the measure of the man's culture from the nature and quality of his conversation during the march, and he rested the success of his reply upon the estimate he had made. "Greek," he explained. "Oh, I thought it was Greek," replied the officer, "but it has been so many years since I studied it that I was not sure. In future, however, I will thank you to speak in a language which I am more familiar with." Werper turned his head to hide a grin, whispering to Tarzan it was Greek to him all right, and to me too. But one of the black soldiers mumbled in a low voice to a companion, "I have heard those sounds before. Once at night when I was lost in the jungle, I heard the hairy men of the trees talking among themselves. And their words were like the words of this white man. I wish that we had not found him. He is not a man at all, he is a bad spirit, and we shall have bad luck if we do not let him go," and the fellow rolled his eyes fearfully toward the jungle. His companion laughed nervously and moved away to repeat the conversation, with variations and exaggerations, to others of the black soldiery, so that it was not long before a frightful tale of black magic and sudden death was woven about the giant prisoner and had gone the rounds of the camp. And deep in the gloomy jungle, amidst the darkening shadows of the falling night, a hairy, man-like creature swung swiftly southward upon some secret mission of his own. Chapter 23. A Night of Terror. To Jane Clayton, waiting in the tree where Werper had placed her, it seemed that the long night would never end, yet end it did at last, and within an hour of the coming of dawn her spirits leaped with renewed hope at sight of a solitary horseman approaching along the trail. The flowing burnous, with its loose hood, hid both the face and the figure of the rider, but that it was Fricoult the girl well knew, since he had been garbed as an Arab, and he alone might be expected to seek her hiding place. That which she saw relieved the strain of the long night vigil, but there was much that she did not see. She did not see the black face beneath the white hood, nor the file of ebon horsemen beyond the trail's bend riding slowly in the wake of their leader. These things she did not see at first, and so she leaned downward toward the approaching rider, a cry of welcome forming in her throat. At the first word the man looked up, reining in surprise, and as she saw the black face of Abdul Morak, the Abyssinian, she shrank back in terror among the branches, but it was too late. The man had seen her, and now he called to her to descend. At first she refused, but when a dozen black cavalrymen drew up behind their leader, and at Abdul Murak's command one of them started to climb the tree after her, she realized that resistance was futile, and came slowly down to stand upon the ground before this new captor and plead her cause in the name of justice and humanity. Angered by recent defeat, and by the loss of the gold, the jewels, and his prisoners, Abdul Murak was in no mood to be influenced by any appeal to those softer sentiments to which, as a matter of fact, he was almost a stranger even under the most favorable conditions. He looked for degradation and possible death in punishment for his failures and his misfortunes when he should have returned to his native land and made his report to Menelik, but an acceptable gift might temper the wrath of the emperor. And surely this fair flower of another race should be gratefully received by the black ruler. When Jane Clayton had concluded her appeal, Abdul Morak replied briefly that he would promise her protection, but that he must take her to his emperor. The girl did not need ask him why, and once again hope died within her breast. Resignedly she permitted herself to be lifted to a seat behind one of the troopers, and again, under new masters, her journey was resumed toward what she now began to believe was her inevitable fate. Abdul Morak, bereft of his guides by the battle he had waged against the raiders and himself unfamiliar with the country, had wandered far from the trail he should have followed, and as a result had made but little progress toward the north since the beginning of his flight. Today he was beating toward the west in the hope of coming upon a village where he might obtain guides, but night found him still as far from a realization of his hopes as had the rising sun. It was a dispirited company which went into camp, waterless and hungry, in the dense jungle. Attracted by the horses, lions roared about the boma, and to their hideous din was added the shrill neighs of the terror-stricken beasts they hunted. There was little sleep for man or beast, and the sentries were doubled that there might be enough on duty both to guard against the sudden charge of an overbold or overhungry lion, and to keep the fire blazing, which was an even more effectual barrier against them than the thorny boma. It was well past midnight, and as yet Jane Clayton, notwithstanding that she had passed a sleepless night the night before, had scarcely more than dozed. A sense of impending danger seemed to hang like a black pall over the camp. The veteran troopers of the Black Emperor were nervous and ill at ease. Abdul Murak left his blankets a dozen times to pace restlessly back and forth between the tethered horses and the crackling fire. The girl could see his great frame silhouetted against the lurid glare of the flames, and she guessed from the quick, nervous movements of the man that he was afraid. The roaring of the lions rose in sudden fury, until the earth trembled to the hideous chorus. The horses shrilled their neighs of terror as they lay back upon their halter ropes in their mad endeavors to break loose. A trooper, braver than his fellows, leaped among the kicking, plunging, fear-maddened beasts in a futile attempt to quiet them. A lion, large and fierce and courageous, leaped almost to the boma, full in the bright light from the fire. A sentry raised his piece and fired, and the little leaden pellet unstoppered the vials of hell upon the terror-stricken camp. The shot ploughed a deep and painful furrow in the lion's side, arousing all the bestial fury of the little brain, but abating not a whit the power and vigor of the great body. Unwounded, the boma and the flames might have turned him back, but now the pain and the rage wiped caution from his mind, and with a loud and angry roar he topped the barrier with an easy leap, and was among the horses. What had been pandemonium before became now an indescribable tumult of hideous sound. The stricken horse upon which the lion leapt shrieked out its terror and its agony. Several about it broke their tethers and plunged madly about the camp. Men leaped from their blankets and with guns ready ran toward the picket line, and then from the jungle beyond the boma a dozen lions, emboldened by the example of their fellow, charged fearlessly upon the camp. Singly and in twos and threes they leaped the boma, until the little enclosure was filled with cursing men and screaming horses battling for their lives with the green-eyed devils of the jungle. With the charge of the first lion, Jane Clayton had scrambled to her feet, and now she stood horror-struck at the scene of savage slaughter that swirled and eddied about her. Once a bolting horse knocked her down, and a moment later a lion, leaping in pursuit of another terror-stricken animal, brushed her so closely that she was again thrown from her feet. Amidst the cracking of the rifles and the growls of the carnivora rose the death screams of stricken men and horses as they were dragged down by the blood-mad cats. The leaping carnivora and the plunging horses prevented any concerted action by the Abyssinians. It was every man for himself, and in the melee, the defenseless woman was either forgotten or ignored by her black captors. A score of times was her life menaced by charging lions, by plunging horses, or by the wildly fired bullets of the frightened troopers. Yet there was no chance of escape, for now, with the fiendish cunning of their kind, the tawny hunters commenced to circle about their prey, hemming them within a ring of mighty yellow fangs and sharp, long talons. Again and again an individual lion would dash suddenly among the frightened men and horses, and occasionally a horse, goaded to frenzy by pain or terror, succeeded in racing safely through the circling lions, leaping the boma and escaping into the jungle. But for the men and the woman no such escape was possible. A horse, struck by a stray bullet, fell beside Jane Clayton. A lion leaped across the expiring beast full upon the breast of a black trooper just beyond. The man clubbed his rifle and struck futilely at the broad head, and then he was down and the carnivore was standing above him. Shrieking out his terror, the soldier clawed with puny fingers at the shaggy breast in vain endeavor to push away the grinning jaws. The lion lowered his head, the gaping fangs closed with a single sickening crunch upon the fear-distorted face, and turning strode back across the body of the dead horse, dragging his limp and bloody burden with him. Wide-eyed the girl stood watching. She saw the carnivore step upon the corpse stumblingly as the grisly thing swung between its forepaws, and her eyes remained fixed in fascination while the beast passed within a few paces of her. The interference of the body seemed to enrage the lion. He shook the inanimate clay venomously. He growled and roared hideously at the dead, insensate thing, and then he dropped it, and raised his head to look about in search of some living victim upon which to wreak his ill temper. His yellow eyes fastened themselves balefully upon the figure of the girl, the bristling lips raised, disclosing the grinning fangs. A terrific roar broke from the savage throat, and the great beast crouched to spring upon this new and helpless victim. Quiet had fallen early upon the camp, where Tarzan and Werper lay securely bound. Two nervous sentries paced their beats, their eyes rolling often toward the impenetrable shadows of the gloomy jungle. The others slept or tried to sleep, all but the ape-man. Silently and powerfully he strained at the bonds which fettered his wrists. The muscles knotted beneath the smooth, brown skin of his arms and shoulders. The veins stood out upon his temples from the force of his exertions. A strand parted, another, and one hand was free. Then from the jungle came a low guttural, and the ape-man became suddenly a silent, rigid statue, with ears and nostrils straining to span the black void where his eyesight could not reach. Again came the uncanny sound from the thick verdure beyond the camp. A sentry halted abruptly, straining his eyes into the gloom. The kinky wool upon his head stiffened and raised. He called to his comrade in a hoarse whisper. "Did you hear it?" he asked. The other came closer, trembling. "Hear what?" Again was the weird sound repeated, followed almost immediately by a similar and answering sound from the camp. The sentries drew close together, watching the black spot from which the voice seemed to come. Trees overhung the boma at this point, which was upon the opposite side of the camp from them. They dared not approach. Their terror even prevented them from arousing their fellows. They could only stand in frozen fear and watch for the fearsome apparition they momentarily expected to see leap from the jungle. Nor had they long to wait. A dim, bulky form dropped lightly from the branches of a tree into the camp. At sight of it, one of the sentries recovered command of his muscles and his voice. Screaming loudly to awaken the sleeping camp, he leapt toward the flickering watchfire and threw a mass of brush upon it. The white officer and the black soldiers sprang from their blankets. The flames leaped high upon the rejuvenated fire, lighting the entire camp, and the awakened men shrank back in superstitious terror from the sight that met their frightened and astonished vision. A dozen huge and hairy forms loomed large beneath the trees at the far side of the enclosure. The white giant, one hand freed, had struggled to his knees and was calling to the frightful, nocturnal visitors in a hideous medley of bestial gutturals, barkings, and growlings. Werper had managed to sit up. He, too, saw the savage faces of the approaching anthropoids and scarcely knew whether to be relieved or terror-stricken. Growling, the great apes leaped forward toward Tarzan and Werper. Chulk led them. The Belgian officer called to his men to fire upon the intruders, but the Negroes held back, filled as they were with superstitious terror of the hairy treeman, and with the conviction that the white giant who could thus summon the beasts of the jungle to his aid was more than human. Drawing his own weapon, the officer fired, and Tarzan, fearing the effect of the noise upon his really timid friends, called to them to hasten and fulfill his commands. A couple of the apes turned and fled at the sound of the firearm, but Chulk and a half-dozen others waddled rapidly forward, and following the ape-man's directions, seized both him and Werper and bore them off toward the jungle. By dint of threats, reproaches, and profanity, the Belgian officer succeeded in persuading his trembling command to fire a volley after the retreating apes. A ragged, straggling volley it was, but at least one of its bullets found a mark, for as the jungle closed about the hairy rescuers, Chulk, who bore Werper across one broad shoulder, staggered and fell. In an instant he was up again, but the Belgian guessed from his unsteady gait that he was hard hit. He lagged far behind the others, and it was several minutes after they had halted at Tarzan's command before he came slowly up to them, reeling from side to side and at last falling again beneath the weight of his burden and the shock of his wound. As Chulk went down, he dropped Werper, so that the latter fell face downward with the body of the ape lying half across him. In this position the Belgian felt something resting against his hands, which were still bound at his back, something that was not a part of the hairy body of the ape. Mechanically the man's fingers felt of the object resting almost in their grasp. It was a soft pouch filled with small, hard particles. Werper gasped in wonderment as recognition filtered through the incredulity of his mind. It was impossible, and yet it was true. Feverishly he strove to remove the pouch from the ape and transfer it to his own possession, but the restricted radius to which his bonds held his hands prevented this, though he did succeed in tucking the pouch with its precious contents inside the waistband of his trousers. Tarzan, sitting at a short distance, was busy with the remaining knots of the cords which bound him. Presently he flung aside the last of them and rose to his feet. Approaching Werper, he knelt beside him. For a moment he examined the ape. "Quite dead," he announced. "It is too bad, he was a splendid creature," and then he turned to the work of liberating the Belgian. He freed his hands first, and then commenced upon the knots at his ankles. "I can do the rest," said the Belgian. "I have a small pocket knife which they overlooked when they searched me." And in this way he succeeded in ridding himself of the ape-man's attentions that he might find and open his little knife, and cut the thong which fastened the pouch about Chalk's shoulder, and transfer it from his waistband to the breast of his shirt. Then he rose and approached Tarzan. Once again had avarice claimed him. Forgotten were the good intentions which the confidence of Jane Clayton in his honor had awakened. What she had done, the little pouch had undone. How it had come upon the person of the great ape, Werper could not imagine, unless it had been that the anthropoid had witnessed his fight with Ahmed Zik, seen the Arab with the pouch and taken it away from him. But that this pouch contained the jewels of Opar, Werper was positive. And that was all that interested him greatly. "Now," said the ape-man, "keep your promise to me. Lead me to the spot where you last saw my wife." It was slow work pushing through the jungle in the dead of night behind the slow-moving Belgian. The ape-man chafed at the delay, but the European could not swing through the trees as could his more agile and muscular companions, and so the speed of all was limited to that of the slowest. The apes trailed out behind the two white men for a matter of a few miles, but presently their interest lagged. The foremost of them halted in a little glade, and the others stopped at his side. There they sat peering from beneath their shaggy brows at the figures of the two men forging steadily ahead, until the latter disappeared in the leafy trail beyond the clearing. Then an ape sought a comfortable couch beneath a tree, and one by one the others followed his example, so that Werper and Tarzan continued their journey alone, nor was the latter either surprised or concerned. The two had gone but a short distance beyond the glade where the apes had deserted them, when the roaring of distant lions fell upon their ears. The ape-man paid no attention to the familiar sounds until the crack of a rifle came faintly from the same direction, and when this was followed by the shrill neighing of horses, and an almost continuous fusillade of shots intermingled with increased and savage roaring of a large troop of lions, he became immediately concerned. "Someone is having trouble over there," he said, turning toward Werper. "I'll have to go to them, they may be friends." "Your wife might be among them," suggested the Belgian, for since he had again come into possession of the pouch he had become fearful and suspicious of the ape-man, and in his mind had constantly revolved many plans for eluding this giant Englishman, who was at once his savior and his captor. At the suggestion, Tarzan started as though struck with a whip. "God," he cried, "she might be, and the lions are attacking them. They are in the camp. I can tell from the screams of the horses in there. That was the cry of a man in his death agonies. Stay here, man, I will come back for you. I must go first to them." And swinging into a tree, the lithe figure swung rapidly off into the night with the speed and silence of a disembodied spirit. For a moment Werper stood where the ape-man had left him. Then a cunning smile crossed his lips. "Stay here," he asked himself. "Stay here and wait until you return to find and take these jewels from me. Not I, my friend, not I." And turning abruptly eastward, Albert Werper passed through the foliage of a hanging vine and out of the sight of his fellow man forever. Chapter 24. Home. As Tarzan of the Apes hurtled through the trees, the discordant sounds of the battle between the Abyssinians and the lions smote more and more distinctly upon his sensitive ears, redoubling his assurance that the plight of the human element of the conflict was critical indeed. At last the glare of the campfire shone plainly through the intervening trees, and a moment later the giant figure of the ape-man paused upon an overhanging bough to look down upon the bloody scene of carnage below. His quick eye took in the whole scene with a single comprehending glance and stopped upon the figure of a woman standing facing a great lion across the carcass of a horse. The carnivore was crouching to spring as Tarzan discovered the tragic tableau. Numa was almost beneath the branch upon which the ape-man stood, naked and unarmed. There was not even an instant's hesitation upon the part of the latter. It was as though he had not even paused in his swift progress through the trees, so lightning like his survey and comprehension of the scene below him, so instantaneous his consequent action. So hopeless had seemed her situation to her that Jane Clayton but stood in lethargic apathy, awaiting the impact of the huge body that would hurl her to the ground, awaiting the momentary agony that cruel talons and grisly fangs may inflict before the coming of the merciful oblivion which would end her sorrow and her suffering. What use to attempt escape? As well face the hideous end as to be dragged down from behind in futile flight. She did not even close her eyes to shut out the frightful aspect of that snarling face, and so it was that as she saw the lion preparing to charge, she saw, too, a bronzed and mighty figure leap from an overhanging tree at the instant that Numa rose in his spring. Wide went her eyes in wonder and incredulity as she beheld this seeming apparition risen from the dead. The lion was forgotten her own peril, everything save the wondrous miracle of this strange recrudescence. With parted lips, with palms tight pressed against her heaving bosom, the girl leaned forward, large-eyed, enthralled by the vision of her dead mate. She saw the sinewy form leap to the shoulder of the lion, hurtling against the leaping beast like a huge, animate battering ram. She saw the carnivore brushed aside as he was almost upon her, and in the instant she realized that no substanceless wraith could thus turn the charge of a maddened lion with brute force greater than the brute's. Tarzan, her Tarzan, lived. A cry of unspeakable gladness broke from her lips, only to die in terror as she saw the utter defenselessness of her mate, and realized that the lion had recovered himself and was turning upon Tarzan in mad lust for vengeance. At the ape-man's feet lay the discarded rifle of the dead Abyssinian, whose mutilated corpse sprawled where Numa had abandoned it. The quick glance which had swept the ground for some weapon of defense discovered it, and as the lion reared upon his hind legs to seize the rash man-thing who had dared interpose its puny strength between Numa and his prey, the heavy stock whirred through the air and splintered upon the broad forehead. Not as an ordinary mortal might strike a blow did Tarzan of the Apes strike, but with the maddened frenzy of a wild beast backed by the steel thews which his wild, arboreal boyhood had bequeathed him. When the blow ended, the splintered stock was driven through the splintered skull into the savage brain, and the heavy iron barrel was bent into a rude V. In the instant that the lion sank lifeless to the ground, Jane Clayton threw herself into the eager arms of her husband. For a brief instant he strained her dear form to his breast, and then a glance about him awakened the ape-man to the dangers which still surrounded them. Upon every hand the lions were still leaping upon new victims. Fear-maddened horses still menaced them with their erratic bolting from one side of the enclosure to the other. Bullets from the guns of the defenders who remained alive but added to the perils of their situation. To remain was to court death. Tarzan seized Jane Clayton and lifted her to a broad shoulder. The blacks who had witnessed his advent looked on in amazement as they saw the naked giant leap easily into the branches of the tree from whence he had dropped so uncannily upon the scene, and vanish as he had come, bearing away their prisoner with him. They were too well occupied in self-defense to attempt to halt him, nor could they have done so other than by the wasting of a precious bullet which might be needed the next instant to turn the charge of a savage foe. And so unmolested, Tarzan passed from the camp of the Abyssinians, from which the din of conflict followed him deep into the jungle, until distance gradually obliterated it entirely. Back to the spot where he had left Werper went the ape-man, joy in his heart now, where fear and sorrow had so recently reigned, and in his mind a determination to forgive the Belgian and aid him in making good his escape. But when he came to the place, Werper was gone, and though Tarzan called aloud many times, he received no reply. Convinced that the man had purposely eluded him for reasons of his own, John Clayton felt that he was under no obligations to expose his wife to further danger and discomfort in the prosecution of a more thorough search for the missing Belgian. "He has acknowledged his guilt by his flight, Jane," he said. "We will let him go to lie in the bed that he has made for himself." Straight as homing pigeons, the two made their way toward the ruin and desolation that had once been the center of their happy lives, and which was soon to be restored by the willing black hands of laughing laborers, made happy again by the return of the master and mistress whom they had mourned as dead. Past the village of Akmitzik their way led them, and there they found but the charred remains of the palisade and the native huts, still smoking, as mute evidence of the wrath and vengeance of a powerful enemy. The Waziri commented Tarzan with a grim smile. "God bless them," cried Jane Clayton. "They cannot be far ahead of us," said Tarzan, Bazuli and the others. "The gold is gone and the jewels of Opar, Jane, but we have each other and the Waziri, and we have love and loyalty and friendship. And what a gold and jewels to these!" "If only poor Mugambi lived," she replied, "and those other brave fellows who sacrificed their lives in vain endeavor to protect me." In the silence of mingled joy and sorrow they passed along through the familiar jungle, and as the afternoon was waning there came faintly to the ears of the ape-man the murmuring cadence of distant voices. "We are nearing the Waziri, Jane," he said. "I can hear them ahead of us. They are going into camp for the night, I imagine." A half-hour later the two came upon a horde of ebon warriors which Basuli had collected for his war of vengeance upon the raiders. With them were the captured women of the tribe whom they had found in the village of Akmitzik, and tall, even among the giant Waziri, loomed a familiar black form at the side of Bazuli. It was Mugambi, whom Jane had thought dead amidst the charred ruins of the bungalow. Ah, such a reunion. Long into the night, the dancing and the singing and the laughter awoke the echoes of the somber wood. Again and again were the stories of their various adventures retold. Again and once again they fought their battles with savage beast and savage man, and dawn was already breaking when Bazuli, for the 40th time, narrated how he and a handful of his warriors had watched the battle for the golden ingots which the Abyssinians of Abdul Murak had waged against the Arab raiders of Ekmitzik, and how, when the victors had ridden away, they had sneaked out of the river reeds and stolen away with the precious ingots to hide them where no robber eye ever could discover them. Pieced out from the fragments of their various experiences with the Belgian, the truth concerning the malign activities of Albert Werper became apparent. Only Lady Greystoke found aught to praise in the conduct of the man, and it was difficult even for her to reconcile his many heinous acts with this one evidence of chivalry and honor. Deep in the soul of every man, said Tarzan, must lurk the germ of righteousness. It was your own virtue, Jane, rather even than your helplessness, which awakened for an instant the latent decency of this degraded man. In that one act he retrieved himself, and when he is called to face his Maker, may it outweigh in the balance all the sins he has committed. And Jane Clayton breathed a fervent Amen. Months had passed. The labor of the Waziri and the gold of Opar had rebuilt and refurnished the wasted homestead of the Greystokes. Once more the simple life of the great African farm went on, as it had before the coming of the Belgian and the Arab. Forgotten were the sorrows and dangers of yesterday. For the first time in months Lord Greystoke felt that he might indulge in a holiday, and so a great hunt was organized that the faithful laborers might feast in celebration of the completion of their work. In itself the hunt was a success, and 10 days after its inauguration a well-laden safari took up its return march toward the Waziri Plain. Lord and Lady Greystoke with Bazuli and Mugambi rode together at the head of the column, laughing and talking together in that easy familiarity which common interests and mutual respect breed between honest and intelligent men of any races. Jane Clayton's horse shied suddenly at an object half hidden in the long grasses of an open space in the jungle. Tarzan's keen eyes sought quickly for an explanation of the animal's action. "What have we here?" he cried, swinging from his saddle, and a moment later the four were grouped about a human skull and a little litter of whitened human bones. Tarzan stooped and lifted a leathern pouch from the grisly relics of a man. The hard outlines of the contents brought an exclamation of surprise to his lips. "The jewels of Opar," he cried, holding the pouch aloft and pointing to the bones at his feet. "All that remains of Werper the Belgian." Mugambi laughed. "Look within, Bwana," he cried, "and you will see what are the jewels of Opar. You will see what the Belgian gave his life for." And the black laughed aloud. "Why do you laugh?" asked Tarzan. "Because," replied Mugambi, "I filled the Belgian's pouch with river gravel before I escaped the camp of the Abyssinians whose prisoners we were. I left the Belgian only worthless stones, while I brought away with me the jewels he had stolen from you. That they were afterwards stolen from me while I slept in the jungle is my shame and my disgrace, but at least the Belgian lost them open his pouch, and you will see." Tarzan untied the thong which held the mouth of the leathern bag closed and permitted the contents to trickle slowly forth into his open palm. Mugambi's eyes went wide at the sight, and the others uttered exclamations of surprise and incredulity, for, from the rusty and weather-worn pouch ran a stream of brilliant, scintillating gems. "The jewels of Opar," cried Tarzan, "but how did Werper come by them again?" None could answer, for both Chalk and Werper were dead, and no other knew. "Poor devil," said the ape-man, as he swung back into his saddle. "Even in death he has made restitution. Let his sins lie with his bones." The end. Best audiobooks for free. Hope that you have enjoyed this production of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan and the Jewels of Opar. Please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and Rumble, as your subscription is the support we need to create more great free content.